My father taught me to read the ocean before he taught me to read words. He said the sea speaks in a language older than any human tongue. In the color of water at depth, in the particular way a swell rolls when something enormous moves beneath it, in the smell of the wind 2 hours before a storm that no instrument has yet detected. He said, if you learn to listen, really listen, the ocean will tell you everything. Where the fish are, where the current breaks, where the pressure changes, and the water goes cold and dark in ways that mean you are now in territory that belongs to something else. I was 4 years old when he first took me out past the breakwater in his boat. 40 years later, I still hear his voice every time I step onto a deck. His name was Hiroshi Tanaka. He fished the waters off Hokkaido for 51 years and never once lost a crew member. Not to weather, not to equipment failure, not to the sea herself, which took men regularly in those waters, the way the sea takes men everywhere, without apology, without warning, as a simple statement of fact about who owns what. He died in his bed at 78, which is not how fishermen usually die. I thought about him on the morning the sky turned silver. I was 300 kilometers offshore, running a long line for Pacific bluefin in water that was 4 degrees Celsius at the surface and dropping fast below. My crew was 4, Kenji, my first mate, who had been with me for 11 years, Sato, the youngest, barely 22, who moved on a boat deck the way cats move on rooftops, Hideo, who was 60 and had more ocean miles in him than any man I had ever met, and a woman named Park Ji-won, a marine biologist from Seoul, who had been studying deep current patterns in the Oyashio and who had no business being on a fishing vessel, except that she had asked so carefully and so persistently that refusing her had begun to seem like more effort than saying yes. The sky turned silver at 061, not the silver of clouds, not the silver of a peculiar atmospheric refraction, the silver of metal, the silver of something so vast that it replaced the sky the way a ceiling replaces the open air when you walk indoors, completely, without negotiation, without the courtesy of a gradual transition. I put down my coffee. The radio was already screaming, not one channel, every channel. Military frequencies I had not heard since my single year of mandatory service, overlapping with civilian emergency broadcasts, overlapping with something else entirely. A transmission on a frequency that did not correspond to any band in use by any human system, pulsing in a rhythm that felt less like communication and more like a heartbeat. Kenji came up from below with his eyes already on the sky. "What is it?" he said. I did not answer because I did not know, and I have never been a man who fills silence with words that carry no weight. The first ship descended through the silver at 0631, then the second, then 30 more in the span of 4 minutes. Each one wider than the city of Sapporo, each one shaped like something between a blade and a living thing, curved in ways that suggested organic growth rather than manufactured assembly, dark as deep water, trailing atmosphere in visible waves of displaced heat. They did not hover. They settled. Onto the ocean surface, onto land, distributed across the planet with the deliberate spacing of a species that had done this before and had a preferred geometry for it. My name is Riku Tanaka. I am 44 years old. I have fished the North Pacific for 25 years. I have seen weather that would stop your heart and ocean conditions that rewrote what I thought survival meant. I have pulled men from water cold enough to kill them in 8 minutes and gotten them back to port alive through nothing but stubborn refusal to accept the arithmetic. I thought I understood what the sea could do to a person's sense of scale. I was wrong. The creatures called themselves the Pelagian Dominion. Their message came in every human language simultaneously, not translated, not approximated, but spoken with perfect fluency, as if they had been listening to us for long enough to learn not just the words, but the specific regional inflections. Whatever algorithm they used for language acquisition was so complete that the broadcast to Japan came in Hokkaido dialect. I learned later that the broadcast to rural Mississippi came in a specific generational vernacular that linguists estimated had fewer than 80,000 living speakers. They had been watching us for a long time. Their leader, their depth commander, the translation said, which implied a military structure organized around oceanic metaphor, appeared on every screen, every phone, every surface capable of displaying an image. It was large. The proportions were wrong for anything evolved on land, the torso too wide, the limbs too long, the head flattened and wide, with eyes positioned far to the sides in the manner of a creature whose primary survival strategy was peripheral awareness rather than forward focus. Its skin, if skin was the right word, shifted color the way a cephalopod shifts color, not randomly, but with intention, the patterns moving in waves that the translation software identified as a secondary communication channel running parallel to the spoken words. It said, "Your coastal infrastructure is now under Dominion control. Your ocean supply lines are severed. Your port cities will be given the opportunity to formally submit within 48 hours. Resistance is recorded, but not recommended." Those were the words that mattered. The rest, as my father would have said, was current. The Pelagian Dominion was, in the most precise biological sense, an aquatic apex predator species that had developed technology. They breathed both air and water with equal ease. Their ships were as functional submerged as they were on the surface or in atmosphere. More functional, actually, because their engineering aesthetic was optimized for fluid dynamics in a way that made their vessels faster and more maneuverable underwater than any human submarine. They had evolved in an ocean environment, conquered their own world's land masses as a secondary expansion, and then taken their oceanic strategic doctrine to the stars. The doctrine was simple and had worked on every world they had taken. Control the water, and everything that depends on the water dies or submits. On most worlds, that was enough. Earth's surface is 71% ocean. Our food systems, our trade systems, our climate systems, our atmospheric oxygen production, all of it runs through or because of the sea. The Pelagian analysis of Earth, intercepted and decoded much later, showed that their strategic models predicted full submission within 60 days of coastal control. Cut the ports, sink the shipping, control the fish stocks, burn the coastal cities that resisted. It was not a bad model. For a species that lived on land and looked at the ocean as a resource they accessed from the shore, it would have worked perfectly. The problem, and it took them a long time to understand, this was a problem, was the 71%. They controlled the surface of it. They had no idea what lived in the rest. Submarines, the world's navies, engaged within 6 hours of the initial landing. I watched the first engagement from my boat on a screen. Kenji had rigged to a satellite connection that was intermittently functional, flickering in and out as the Dominion systematically dismantled orbital communication infrastructure with the methodical patience of a species that understood you do not need to rush a process you have already completed 140 times. The carrier battle groups were the first to go, not quickly, not cruelly, efficiently. The Dominion ships simply submerged beneath the surface, beyond the effective range of anything that launched from above the waterline, and then rose directly beneath the carrier groups, at a range where the physics of the engagement left no meaningful response window. The carriers died from below, one by one in the specific order that suggested the Dominion had planned the sequence in advance. Largest threat eliminated first, then descending by capability, then by position relative to their own assets. The submarines fared differently, not better, differently. The Dominion let the submarines approach, let them fire. The torpedoes impacted on hull materials that absorbed and redistributed kinetic energy, with a passive elegance that no active defense system could have matched at that efficiency. Then the Dominion ships turned on the submarines individually, and the submarines discovered that whatever sensor advantage they had possessed in human naval warfare was simply not relevant against a species whose entire sensory evolution had occurred underwater. They heard everything, they saw everything. In water, they were without peer. Coastal cities that resisted were not destroyed. They were isolated. The Dominion established a perimeter around each resistant coastal population center, not close enough to engage directly, but close enough to make it clear that nothing was entering or leaving by sea. They burned the ports. They sank anything that moved on the surface. They waited with the particular patience of a predator that understands time as a weapon. Then they began burning the cities that had not yet submitted, not all of them, selected ones. As demonstrations, Osaka went first, then Sydney, then Cape Town, then Santos in Brazil, each one preceded by a 24-hour warning to evacuate, which the Dominion broadcast with what I came to understand was their version of reluctance. They did not want to destroy the infrastructure. They wanted to inherit it. The burning was a communication, A recalibration of the conversation. Most governments submitted within the first 2 weeks. The formal submissions were broadcast globally. Heads of state, in whatever ceremonial setting they could assemble, given the state of their cities, reading prepared statements of conditional cooperation in the manner of people who were buying time and knew it, and were not sure what they were buying it for. Japan did not submit, not officially, not yet. I learned later that this was partly policy and partly practical. The relevant decision-makers were scattered, and communications were unreliable, and there was a genuine question of whether anyone with the authority to formally submit actually retained the capacity to reach the Dominion's receiving channels. But I also think, because I am Japanese and I know how we are, that it was partly something older than policy. Something that has to do with the specific way the Japanese relationship with the sea has been shaped over 4,000 years of fishing the most dangerous waters on the planet. We do not submit to the ocean. We work within it. I sat on my boat in the North Pacific, 300 kilometers from a coastline I could no longer safely approach, and I thought about what my father had told me about reading water. And then I thought about what was underneath me. Undergally, the recall came on the 19th day, not through any official channel. Those were compromised or destroyed. It came through a frequency I had not heard used in my lifetime, a shortwave band that fishing vessels had used for emergency communication in the years before satellite systems made it obsolete. Someone had remembered it. Someone had thought carefully about what channels the Dominion would bother to monitor, and concluded that the answer was probably not a shortwave frequency primarily associated with mid-20th century fishing boats. The message was brief and in Japanese and used a phrase my father had used when calling crew to an urgent situation on deck: Mizu no shita ni iru. In the water beneath, coordinates followed. A location in the Western Pacific, 800 kilometers east of the Japanese coast, in a stretch of ocean that appeared on standard charts as featureless deep water. I knew it as something else. My father had fished that area for 3 decades and had shown me, on hand-drawn charts he kept in a waterproof case in the hold of his first boat, the underwater topography that standard charts didn't capture, the seamounts, the cold water upwellings, the specific pressure zones where certain currents converged in ways that created natural acoustic dead zones, places where sound traveled differently, where sensors that relied on water-conducted signals would find interference patterns that complicated accurate positioning, places where a boat could sit and not be found by something that was looking from below. I changed course and told my crew nothing until we were moving. Then I told them everything, which was not much. I told them we were going to a meeting. I told them I did not know who had called it or what they wanted. I told them they could leave the boat on the inflatable if they chose to, and I would not think less of them. Kenji said, "Where would we go?" Sato said nothing, but he checked the fuel levels and updated the navigation, and went back to watching the water. Hideo said, "Your father used to fish that area." "Yes," I said. He nodded and went below to sleep, which is what Hideo did when there was nothing useful he could contribute to the immediate situation. He slept. He saved his energy. He had been doing it for 40 years, and it was, I thought, one of the wisest things about him. Park Ji-won said, "I want to come too." I had not considered asking her to leave. She had spent 6 weeks studying the deep current patterns of the Oyashio from my deck, and in that time she had demonstrated a capacity for calm observation under difficult conditions that I found more useful than most trained soldiers I had met. She also knew things about the ocean at depth that I did not know, and I had the feeling, the specific intuitive sensation I get on the water when something is about to become important that I cannot yet see. That depth was going to matter. We reached the coordinates on the 22nd day. Hongrummler. The meeting was held below the surface, not deep, 12 meters in a natural cavern formed by a seamount that rose to within 15 meters of the surface before dropping away on all sides to abyssal depth. The seamount appeared on no chart I had ever seen. I found it the way my father had taught me to find underwater features, by reading the surface behavior of the water above it, the specific way a swell refracts and slows when there is something solid beneath. There were 11 boats already anchored on the surface above it. Fishing vessels, most of them. A Taiwanese longliner, 2 Korean trawlers, a collection of smaller craft from the Philippines and Indonesia, and one extraordinary vessel, a traditional Filipino para outrigger that had no business being this far from shore, and whose presence told me something specific and important about the person who had sailed it here. We dove with what equipment we had. At 12 meters, in the cavern we found the others, 17 people in total, including my crew. I will describe the ones who mattered most to what came after, because what came after required specific people with specific knowledge, and there were no coincidences in who was in that cave. There was Captain Lee Jae-won, 61, a retired Korean Navy submarine commander who had spent 30 years in nuclear submarines and who knew the underwater acoustic environment of the Western Pacific the way other men know city streets. By memory, by feel, by the specific quality of silence in different zones. He was a compact man with very still eyes who spoke rarely and precisely. There was Imelda Cruz, 47, a Filipino freediver who held multiple national records and who could reach 90 meters on a single breath and stay there long enough to make you genuinely wonder whether the classification of human as an air-breathing species was perhaps a bureaucratic oversight rather than a biological fact. She had grown up in the Tubataha Reef System and knew the underwater terrain of the Sulu Sea with the specific intimacy of someone who had spent more of her life below the surface than above it. There was Wirmu Tain, 53, a New Zealand Maori deep-sea fisherman who had also, and this was not incidental, spent 15 years as a commercial dive instructor training saturation divers for the offshore oil industry. He knew how humans behaved under pressure, physiologically, psychologically. He knew where people broke and how to keep them from breaking there. There was Amara Osi, 38, a Ghanaian marine engineer who had designed and maintained underwater infrastructure in the Gulf of Guinea for a decade, and who looked at the Dominion's submerged equipment, what could be observed of it from the surface before satellite imaging went dark, and saw not a military marvel but an engineering system with the specific vulnerabilities of any system optimized for one environment. And there was Dr. Park Ji-won, who had said almost nothing since we dove into the cave, but whose eyes had been moving from face to face with the careful attentiveness of someone taking inventory. I did not know who had called the meeting. No one claimed responsibility for it. We looked at each other in 12 meters of water, with torches making green-gold light on the cave walls, and we understood. The way people who have spent their lives reading environments understand things without words, that we had each arrived here by following the same logic independently. The logic was simple. The Dominion owned the surface of the ocean. They had weapons that dominated every engagement on or above the waterline. Their sensors were optimized for tracking movement in the standard pressure and salinity ranges of the upper ocean, the zones where their own ships operated, where conventional naval vessels moved, where everything they had ever needed to track had existed. They had not, as far as any of us could determine, deployed significant assets below 300 meters. Below 300 meters, the ocean is a different world. Colder, darker, under pressure that destroys the structural integrity of any vessel not specifically engineered for it. The Dominion's ships were extraordinary pieces of technology. They were not, as Amara Osi pointed out in the careful, methodical way of an engineer identifying a specification gap, designed for the deep ocean of a world they had surveyed from orbit and assessed as a surface water naval environment. They had not built for the deep because they did not believe anything relevant lived there. They were right about most species on most worlds. On those worlds, the deep ocean was either uninhabited or inhabited by things with no tactical utility. On Earth, the deep ocean was where humans had been sending machines, conducting research, laying cable, and developing the most specialized knowledge base in the history of the planet for the better part of a century. We had humans who had been to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. We had mapped more of the deep ocean floor in the previous 30 years than in all of prior human history combined. We had built pressure vessels, remotely operated vehicles, deep diving submarines, and saturation diving systems that allowed humans to live and work at depths that should physiologically kill them. We also had people in that cave, who had spent their lives in water the Dominion had not bothered to cover. Below 300 meters, we were ghosts. Hongaries. I spent the next 12 days doing what my father taught me to do when I entered new fishing grounds. I watched Kenji and Hideo ran the boat on the surface in careful, unprovocative patterns. Fishing, because fishing was what fishing boats did, and the Dominion had not yet begun systematically targeting small fishing vessels, perhaps because a species that controls an ocean naturally categorizes small surface craft as noise rather than threat. The Dominion's strategic patience was, in those early weeks, one of their most dangerous qualities. They were not in a hurry. They had done this 140 times. They knew the timeline. Below the surface, I watched. I dove with Imelda Cruz, and I watched the Dominion's submerged assets the way my father had taught me to watch a new school of fish, not focusing on any single element but taking in the whole pattern. The patrol rhythms, the spacing, the way their ships moved in current versus against it, how their sensor arrays oriented when a surface disturbance occurred, how long their response time was to an unexpected acoustic signal. I filled a waterproof notebook with observations and sketches. Imelda filled one too. We compared them each evening in the cave and found that we had noticed different things, which was useful. I read movement and pattern from a fisherman's perspective. She read it from a freediver's perspective, and together we saw more than either of us would have alone. By the end of the 12th day, I had what I needed. 3 things. Specifically the first, the Dominion sensor arrays had a pressure calibration delay. When their ships transited from shallow water to deep water, or vice versa, crossing the thermocline, the boundary layer where cold deep water meets warmer surface water, their acoustic sensors required approximately 90 seconds to recalibrate to the new pressure environment. For 90 seconds on each transit, their underwater detection was degraded, not blind, but degraded. In 90 seconds, a diver in dark water is invisible. The second, their hull materials, which were extraordinary at absorbing kinetic energy and dispersing it as heat, had a specific thermal expansion rate that Amara Osi identified from observation as inconsistent with deep cold water. At depth below 200 meters, the temperature differential between the hull material and the surrounding water created a stress pattern in the material's molecular structure. Not enough to cause failure at rest, potentially significant under repeated pressure cycling, the kind that would occur if a hull were taken repeatedly through rapid depth changes. The third, they never looked up. In water as on land, the Dominion's tactical doctrine was built for threats that approached from the same depth. Their sensor arrays focused horizontally and downward, looking for things that came at them from the deep, which on their homeworld had presumably been the primary direction of danger. They did not, as far as I could observe, systematically monitor the water column above them. Why would they? On every world they had taken, nothing above them in the water had posed a threat. The threatening things were always below. On Earth, we had Imelda Cruz, who could reach 90 meters on a single breath, and who could approach the upper hull of a Dominion vessel from above in absolute silence with no equipment signature of any kind. Half an inch of gap between hull plate and sensor housing was all a blade needed, or a package, sealed in wax, attached to a specific point on a hull with a magnetic clamp, designed to cycle through pressure changes until the material stress reached threshold. I sat in the cave on the 12th evening, and I drew the plan in my notebook the way my father had drawn fishing charts, by hand, with careful attention to the things that mattered and no attention to anything else. Then I swam up to the surface and found Amara Ose, and I asked her what she would need to build something that could exploit a thermal stress fracture in an alien hull material, using only what we had available or could acquire from the deepwater research cache that Lee Jae-won had identified at an unmanned station 400 meters down on the seamount's eastern face. She thought for a moment. She said, 3 days, and I need wiremew for the pressure housing. I said, you have 2. She almost smiled. She went to find wiremew. We executed the first operation on a night with no moon, which in the North Pacific in that season means no light at all. The surface was running 3-meter swells from a system passing to the north, which created enough acoustic noise to complicate passive sonar readings and enough surface chop to make the water above the Dominion patrol routes visually chaotic. My father had taught me to love heavy weather. He said the sea in a storm is the most honest version of itself. Everything stripped down to what actually matters. No room for anything that does not serve a purpose. I had always found something clarifying in rough conditions. The simplification of it. Imelda dove first with the package Amara had built, a wax-sealed cylinder the size of a large thermos, charged with a compound that Amara described as a thermal amplifier. It would not explode. It would not destroy the hull. It would simply accelerate the natural thermal stress process in the target material by a factor of approximately 60, compressing 3 years of pressure cycling fatigue into a matter of hours. It was attached with a magnetic clamp to a specific location on the Dominion patrol ship's hull, the junction between 2 hull plate sections, where the stress concentration would be highest. While the ship was sitting at rest at 40 meters depth, sensors recalibrating from a recent depth transit, Imelda was at depth and back to the surface in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She surfaced 20 meters from my boat in 3-meter swells without using a light. I heard her before I saw her. A specific sound, not a voice, the sound she made by snapping her fingers twice underwater, which carried to me on the surface through the hull of the boat. She climbed aboard and said nothing. She went below and I heard her breathing in the controlled pattern she used after a deep dive. The recovery breath, slow and deliberate, the breath of someone who treats their lungs with the respect due a precision instrument. We moved north. We ran the engine at low RPM, in the pattern of a fishing boat returning from a set. We were 40 kilometers away when the thermal amplifier reached threshold. I know what happened because Lee Jae-won, running passive hydrophone monitoring from below in a 2-person submersible that dated from 1987 and had no business being in operational use, but was listening to the acoustic signature of the Dominion vessel when the hull section failed. He described it later as the sound of ice fracturing in deep cold water, a sound he knew from his submarine years, from operating under Arctic ice sheets. A sharp crack followed by the particular harmonic of pressurized material releasing into its surrounding medium. Then the rush of water through a compromised section. Then, after approximately 4 seconds, the sound of a Dominion crew responding to an emergency that their tactical doctrine had no category for. They were not destroyed. The fracture was not catastrophic. But a ship with a compromised hull section at operating depth cannot maintain operational tempo without risking escalation to catastrophic. They had to surface. They had to withdraw to a repair facility. The patrol route was uncovered. In the window that created, Lee Jae-won moved the submersible 200 meters north, to the location of the Dominion's primary deep-water communication relay, a device anchored at 400 meters that served as the hub for all submerged tactical coordination in a 500-kilometer radius. He spent 40 minutes attaching a device that Amara had described as an inductive interference generator, a simple electromagnetic pulse emitter powered by a salvaged deep-water battery pack that would not destroy the relay but would introduce noise into its transmission at precisely the frequency band the Dominion used for their submerged coordination channel. He surfaced. He said 2 words. "It is done." The relay went noisy at 0340. In the 3 hours before the Dominion identified the problem and dispatched a repair team, the underwater coordination in that 500-kilometer radius degraded to the point where 2 patrol ships made navigational decisions based on corrupted positioning data and collided at 80 meters depth. Not hard enough to destroy them, hard enough to require them both to surface. 3 patrol routes uncovered. In the North Pacific, in a stretch of water that, to the Dominion, appeared to be unoccupied open ocean. That was the first operation. It would not be the last. Hongra, within 3 weeks, similar cells had formed across every ocean on the planet. I did not know about them at the time. We shared nothing by signal, no radio, no satellite, no digital communication of any kind. The Dominion monitored all of it. What we shared was the same logic, arrived at independently by people who had spent their lives in the ocean the Dominion thought they controlled, and who looked at the same situation and saw the same gap. In the Coral Sea, a team of Aboriginal Australian saltwater people and Torres Strait Islander fishermen, people whose relationship with that reef system extended back 60 years and who knew every current, every depth, every seasonal pattern of that water with an accuracy no instrument could match, began systematically relocating Dominion acoustic sensor buoys, not destroying them, moving them 3 meters here, 8 meters there, introducing calibration drift that accumulated slowly, that no single adjustment would explain, that caused the sensor network to develop a growing blind spot in a 200-kilometer section of the eastern coral approaches. It took them 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, the Coral Sea approaches were effectively unmonitored, and the supply vessels that had been rerouted through that corridor, human vessels, carrying food from coastal areas to inland populations being strangled by the blockade, began moving again. In the South Atlantic, a Namibian fishing cooperative working in conjunction with a team of Argentine naval officers who had abandoned their posts when the formal military collapsed, began mapping the Dominion's deep-water supply chain. The Dominion brought materials and personnel down from orbit through specific water entry corridors. Predictable corridors, because the physics of atmospheric entry and water landing constrained the approach angles. The fishing cooperative spent 4 weeks charting these corridors. Then they began placing drift nets, enormous traditional nets weighted with ceramic rather than metal to avoid triggering metallic detection systems, across the predicted paths, not to stop the Dominion transports, to make them alter course, to introduce variability into a supply chain that depended on precise timing and precise positioning. A supply chain under pressure makes errors. The Dominion made errors. In the Philippine Sea, Imelda Cruz's extended network, freediving communities from across the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, people who had been diving these waters without equipment for generations, began conducting what Lee J-1 called reconnaissance at depth. They went where the Dominion sensors were not looking. They observed, they sketched, they surfaced and reported to a coordination point on a small island that appeared on Dominion surveys as uninhabited and remained uninhabited in the sense that no one lived there permanently, though it was remarkably busy on a rotating basis. The Dominion's intelligence officer for the Pacific Theater filed a report at the end of the 4th week, noting anomalous equipment failures, unusual acoustic signatures in 3 operational zones, and an inexplicable pattern of supply chain disruption that their models could not account for. The report was specific and careful. It noted that the pattern was inconsistent with any known form of organized naval resistance. There were no ships, no weapon signatures, no communications intercepts, no identifiable command structure. What there was, the report noted, was water. Water behaving in ways that were technically explicable by natural causes, but that clustered around Dominion assets with a statistical frequency that exceeded natural probability by a considerable margin. The depth commander read the report and reassigned the intelligence officer to administrative duties. The word the depth commander used, intercepted later and translated, meant something approximating the same thing as pest. Hanfanglers. Then they took Hideo. He was on the surface running the boat through a supply transfer. We moved provisions between cells using fishing vessel patterns because fishing boats were the one surface activity the Dominion had continued to tolerate. Perhaps because they understood the food supply implications of eliminating small-scale fishing. Perhaps because they assessed fishing boats as strategically irrelevant. Whatever the reason, we had used it. A Dominion patrol vessel surfaced directly beneath his position. Not as an attack, they surfaced for maintenance, rising through 30 meters in less than a minute. The boat was directly above them. The hull impact was not violent, but it was enough to capsize the vessel, and Hideo's, 60 years old, 40 of those years on the water, a man who moved on a boat deck with absolute confidence and moved in the water with considerably less, went in. The water temperature was 6 degrees Celsius. In 6-degree water, a 60-year-old man has a functional survival window of approximately 8 to 12 minutes before incapacitation. We were not close enough to reach him in time. By the time the Dominion vessel was fully surfaced and their crew had understood what had happened, Hideo was already hypothermic and going under. They pulled him out. I know this because we saw it. Lee Jae-won had a camera array on the submersible, and he was tracking that patrol vessel. They pulled Hideo out of the water. They identified him as human, which at that stage required very little. They had our biometrics from the populations they had processed in the cities they occupied. They would have known within seconds that he was associated with an unregistered vessel operating outside sanctioned fishing zones. They kept him for 9 days. On the 10th day, a Dominion communications vessel surfaced near the Hokkaido coast and broadcast a recorded message on every frequency, in Japanese in Hideo's own voice. The message was short. It was a statement of what happens to those who act against the Dominion. It was followed by a visual record that I will not describe except to say that it was precisely calculated to communicate a specific thing about the cost of resistance. It was followed by the Dominion's own communication. This is what happens to those who act against the Dominion. Submit now, and this does not continue. I received the broadcast in the cave. All of us did. I had known Hideo for 22 years. He had been with me on the first boat I ever captained, before I was ready to captain it, when I was 22 and terrified and trying not to show it. He had never mentioned it. He had simply been there, knowing what he knew, doing what needed doing, in the specific way of a man who understands that the most useful thing he can offer is competence applied without commentary. Nobody in the cave spoke for a very long time. The water moved around us the way water always moves, indifferent, continuous, older than anything any of us had ever encountered. My father's voice was in my head. "The sea doesn't grieve," he had said once. "It just keeps moving. If you want to survive in it, eventually you have to do the same." I did not speak because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't saying better. I felt the thing shift inside me. The thing that happens when loss converts, not to anger, which is hot and imprecise and spends itself, but to something colder and slower and without a natural endpoint. The thing that is not about the war anymore, the thing that is about the hunt. I took out my notebook. I turned to a clean page. I drew one line across the top. I wrote, "Where does the depth commander sleep?" The answer took 11 days to find. Park Ji-won found it. Because Park Ji-won had been doing something with her time in the cave that none of us had fully understood until she showed us. She had been building a model, a three-dimensional acoustic model of the Western Pacific, constructed from the passive hydrophone data that Lee Jae-won had been collecting from the submersible, from the observations Imelda's network had provided from depth, and from 60 years of deep ocean research data that she had carried in her head, and in a set of waterproof field notebooks she treated with the specific reverence of someone who understands that what is written in those books exists nowhere else. The model showed the Dominion's deep water infrastructure with a clarity that no satellite or surface-level observation could have provided. Because the model was built from below, from acoustic signatures, from pressure anomalies, from the specific way sound traveled through the deep ocean around objects of significant mass. At 3,400 meters in the Western Pacific abyssal plain, there was a structure, not a ship, a station, fixed to the abyssal floor, built to be permanent, or at least to last far longer than the expected duration of a standard planetary conquest. It had no acoustic signature consistent with propulsion systems. It had no features consistent with a vessel designed to move. It had features consistent with a command facility, a high-density power source, a communication array oriented upward toward the surface and toward orbit. And this was the detail that mattered, thermal output that, when corrected for the surrounding water temperature, was consistent with a large enclosed space maintained at an atmospheric temperature rather than the 4 degrees Celsius of the surrounding water. Someone was living there. Someone who had decided that the safest place on a contested planet was at the bottom of an ocean that no species he had ever conquered had the capacity to reach. He was not wrong. Not about any species he had previously encountered. Park Ji-won put the notebook in front of me. She said, 3,400 meters, she said. The thermal signature is consistent with living quarters, she said. It is in the acoustic shadow of a seamount ridge that would mask approach from 3 of the 4 cardinal directions. And then she said, I know the current patterns at that depth in this area. There is a consistent cold water drift from the northeast that runs along the abyssal plain at approximately 0.3 knots. It is a geochemical current. It has a specific temperature profile and a specific salinity profile. I have data on it, going back to field research from 2019. If anything were moving in that current in a way that matched its temperature and salinity profile, it would be acoustically and thermally indistinguishable from the current itself. I looked at her for a moment. I said, You're talking about disguising an approach as a current, she said. I'm talking about becoming the water. I looked at Weir Mutane, who was listening from across the cave. He looked back at me, he said. The saturation system from the research cache. At 3,400 meters, it is at the edge of its rated depth, but it is within tolerance for approach with no propulsion noise, Amara Osi said. I can modify the thermal regulation so the external hull output matches the current profile. It will take 4 days, and the system will not have heating reserves for anything except life support at depth, but it can be done. Lee Jae-won said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the acoustic model, he said. The approach window where the seamount ridge provides acoustic shadow. It is there for 6 hours each day when the deep current runs at maximum velocity and the ambient noise floor is highest. We would have to be in position before the window opens and hold depth for the entire transit. 6 hours at 3,400 meters. I said, he said, your father fished for 51 years in water that wanted to kill him. He said, you never lost a crew member. I said, I haven't. He said, I know. The global operation began 10 days later. Not from us. From every cell, on every ocean, on every coast where humans who knew the water had organized themselves and waited for a signal. The signal was not electronic, it was physical. A pattern of surface behavior visible from depth. 3 fishing vessels running parallel courses, lights on, 500 meters apart. A pattern that meant nothing to the Dominion and everything to the people watching for it. In the South Atlantic, the Namibian cooperative and the Argentine officers began the most aggressive operations they had attempted. Direct interference with Dominion's surface assets, using methods developed over weeks of patient preparation. Not to win, to make noise. To create a response requirement that pulled surface and shallow water assets away from the Western Pacific. In the Coral Sea, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait teams activated the blind spot they had spent 6 weeks building and ran an entire convoy through it. 17 human vessels carrying food and medicine, and people who needed to be somewhere other than where they were. Moving in broad daylight through a 200-kilometer section of ocean that the Dominion believed they were watching and were not. In the Philippine Sea, Imelda Cruz's extended network executed simultaneous interventions at 47 separate Dominion assets, sensors, relay stations, patrol route markers, in a 6-hour window that was so geographically dispersed and methodologically varied that the Dominion Tactical Response System flagged it as unclassifiable and defaulted to sending available response assets to each location, which was every available response asset, which was what we needed. In the North Pacific, my boat ran east at full speed, drawing a patrol response. Kenji was at the wheel. Sato was watching the water behind us with binoculars. They knew what they were doing. They were bait, and they were good at it. They ran fast enough to be clearly visible, slowly enough to be catchable, on a course that took them toward a stretch of coast where the shallow water terrain would complicate any submerged pursuit. Below them, the Dominion's attention was elsewhere, at 3,400 meters, moving at 0.3 knots. Temperature matched to the northeast deep current, acoustically passive, running on battery power at life support minimum. The research submersible crept through the acoustic shadow of the seamount ridge toward the command station on the abyssal plain. Weir Mutane was piloting. Lee Jae-won was monitoring acoustics. Park Ji-won was reading the current data and navigating. Imelda Cruz was in the water, not inside the submersible, but outside it, tethered, wearing equipment that Amara had modified to function at this depth, serving as forward sensor, as scout, as the human component of this approach that no technology could replicate. A woman who had spent her life reading water, reading it now at 3,400 meters, reading the way the current broke around the structure ahead, reading the acoustic texture of the water in ways that her instruments could not capture but her body could. She surfaced, rose inside the submersible through the wet entry hatch. At 0340, she said, there is a docking bay on the eastern face. 2 Dominion vessels moored. The bay is open. The current runs directly into it, Lee Jae-won said. Pressure equalization will make sound when we enter the bay. Imelda said, not if we enter on the current. Let the current carry us in. No propulsion. The current carried us in. The inside of the station was vast and dim and maintained at a temperature that, after 6 hours in water that wanted to kill us, felt almost warm. The architecture was the same organic industrial fusion I had seen in the ships. curved walls, grown-looking structural elements, surfaces that shifted color slightly in response to environmental inputs. It was quiet. The hum of life support systems, the distant circulation of water through the station's external cooling, the particular acoustic character of an enclosed space under enormous pressure. We moved through it in pairs. Wiremu and Lee Jae-won took the communication array, the physical hub of the Dominion's deep-water command network. Amara took the power systems. She did not sabotage them. She documented them with the specific attentiveness of an engineer who intends to understand a system completely before deciding how to address it. Park Ji-won went with her, because Park Ji-won had a quality I had come to rely on. She did not need to be told what was useful. She found it. Imelda came with me. We found the depth commander in a chamber that faced the abyssal plane, through a viewport of some material so transparent it was almost invisible, a window into the deep ocean, into absolute darkness, which told me something about him that I found useful. He spent his time looking out into the dark, not at his tactical displays, not at his communication feeds. Into the dark, he was large. The Pelagian Dominion were large as a species, broader and longer than humans, built for buoyancy and speed in water, with the wide flat skull and lateral eyes of a creature whose evolutionary history was oceanic. Out of water, which he was, he moved on limbs that had the quality of a seal on land, functional but clearly not the preferred medium. In water, I suspected he was extraordinary. In a chair, in a pressure habitat at the bottom of an alien ocean, he was something I recognized. He was waiting. He had sent his forces to deal with the disruptions on the surface. He was here at the bottom of the sea, waiting for the reports to come back, for the situation to resolve, for the process that had worked 140 times to work again. He heard us before he saw us. His lateral hearing was acute, the way aquatic predator hearing always is. He came out of his chair fast. He was fast. In the enclosed space of that chamber, with room to move but no water to move through, he was still the most physically capable thing in the room. In water, he would have been untouchable. He was not in water. I have been fishing for 25 years. I have hauled long lines in 6-meter swells and set nets in the dark in waters that could kill a person 8 different ways, and worked alongside men who moved with total confidence in an environment that was trying to kill them constantly. I am not a fighter. I have never described myself as one, but I have spent 25 years reading things that were trying not to be read. Reading water, reading fish, reading weather before it arrives, reading the specific way an animal moves when it is about to do something. The depth commander moved the way a large aquatic predator moves in a confined space, forward, direct, using size and speed as the primary tools, because on every world he had encountered, size and speed had been sufficient. I was not where he expected me to be. I have spent 25 years getting out of the way of things that are larger and faster than me. The sea is larger and faster than me. It has been trying to kill me since I was 4 years old, and I have learned, through iteration, to be somewhere other than where it is going. He was not the sea. He was predictable in the way that a direct charge predator is always predictable. The angle of the charge tells you exactly where the impact will land, and impact is the only tactic it knows. I moved left. I went low. The ceramic blade that Amara had shaped from material recovered from the research station's stock found the gap between his lateral armor and his neck structure, a gap that was, in proportion, not so different from the gap my father had taught me to find when cleaning a very large fish, half an inch. That is all a blade needs. The depth commander of the Pelagian Dominion, conqueror of 140 worlds, died on the floor of a pressure habitat at 3,400 meters beneath the surface of the planet he had come to claim. He died in a room full of darkness, looking at an ocean that was not his. The sounds he made at the end were not sounds I will describe. I cleaned the blade the way my father had taught me to clean a blade. I put it away. I went to find the others. Amara had found what she needed in the power systems room. Not a way to destroy the station, a way to send a signal through it. The Dominion's deep-water communication array, when operated from within the station, could reach every Dominion asset on the planet and in orbit simultaneously. Lee Jae-won had confirmed this from his audio analysis. The array was built for command communication. It was built to be heard. Park Ji-won had spent 40 minutes in the communication room. When I found her, she looked up and said, "I can operate it. I have been reading their communication protocols for 6 weeks. I know the command authentication pattern. She sent the withdrawal order in the depth commander's authentication signature at 0614, which was, by accident or design, exactly 12 hours after the sky had turned silver on the morning the world changed. The order was specific and used language Park Ji-won had identified from intercepted command communications as the formal protocol for strategic reassessment. It did not order retreat, it ordered recalculation. In the Dominion's military culture, she had determined, retreat was not a concept that existed. Recalculation was. A commander who ordered retreat had failed. A commander who ordered recalculation had identified new strategic information requiring updated assessment. The response came in over the next 6 hours. First, the confirmation signals from surface assets, then from orbital assets, then, after a pause that felt very long in the dim quiet of the command station, a signal from the fleet command above the planet. The signal, translated by Park Ji-won in real time, said, "Recalculation approved. Withdrawal to standard assessment orbit. Planetary classification to be reviewed." I sat on the floor of the Dominion's deep-water command station at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and listened to Park Ji-won translate. Then I sat in the quiet and I thought about my father. He had told me once that the ocean will give you everything if you know how to ask, not if you demand it, not if you conquer it. The ocean cannot be conquered. It is too large and too old and too indifferent. But if you learn it, really learn it, the way you learn the face of someone you have loved for a long time, if you learn its moods and its currents and its pressures and its dark places and its habits, then sometimes, in the specific way of something that has been respected long enough to decide you are not a threat, it gives you what you need. The Dominion had come to take the ocean. They had not bothered to learn it. We had spent our whole lives in it. Hungerlies. The fleet left Earth over the course of 9 days. Not all at once, in the methodical way of a large organization executing a complex logistical withdrawal, each asset departing in the sequence that minimized disruption to the others. The ships rose from the ocean surface and from the coastlines and from the upper atmosphere, and they moved outward in the slow, unmistakable way of something very large that has decided to be somewhere else. I watched the last ship leave from the deck of my boat, somewhere in the North Pacific, under a sky that was becoming, incrementally and then completely, just a sky again. The sea was running 4-meter swells from the northwest. The air smelled of cold water and distance. The sun was going down in the specific way it goes down in this part of the ocean in this season. Not dramatically, just thoroughly, the light going from gold to amber to a flat gray that was not darkness yet, but was clearly heading there. Kenji stood beside me. Sato was at the stern watching the last ship dwindle. Neither of them spoke. I thought about Hideo. I did not think about him in the way that produces words. I thought about him the way you think about the ocean in a storm. Present, total, something you move through, rather than something you can see clearly. The Dominion's formal withdrawal communication was broadcast 6 days after the last ship left. It reached Earth on every frequency simultaneously, in the precise way their first message had reached us. In every language, in every regional dialect, with the specific completeness of a species that had been listening to us for long enough to learn how we speak. This world is reclassified. Pelagian Dominion Directive 7741, effective upon receipt. Earth designated Class Omega, Aquatic Apex, Primary. All Dominion assets are ordered to maintain exclusion distance of no less than 0.8 astronomicals from this system without direct command authorization from Dominion Prime. The designation reflects the following assessment. The indigenous species of this world has demonstrated complete aquatic domain knowledge exceeding that of Dominion survey estimates by a factor not accommodatable within standard classification parameters. This species has inhabited, navigated, harvested, and conducted warfare within the entirety of their world's oceanic volume, including abyssal regions to maximum recorded depth, for a period extending beyond the Dominion's own spacefaring history. They have done so without technology in many cases. They have done so in environmental conditions lethal to Dominion personnel. They have done so with a comprehensive ecological knowledge of oceanic systems that no Dominion survey has replicated. This world's ocean is not an asset. It is a weapon. The species that lives in it is not a population to be managed. It is the ocean's immune system, and it has determined that we are an infection. Do not return. I heard it on the boat's radio. All channels, as promised. I turned the radio off. I went below and made tea. Hot, strong, the way my father had always made it. I brought 2 cups up to the deck and gave one to Kenji, and we stood there drinking it in the cold Pacific air, while the swell moved under us in the ancient, indifferent way it had always moved. 7 months later, I was at a conference in Tokyo. One of the first international meetings since the withdrawal, gathering people who had coordinated the oceanic resistance from a dozen different regions, people I had worked alongside without ever meeting in person. Across the table was a delegation from the Finari, a small, nervous people who had been under Dominion control for 2 centuries, and who had used the political vacuum created by the withdrawal to negotiate their own independence from Dominion's secondary territories. Their representative was polite and careful, and kept his eyes on the table more often than on the people around it. At some point in the proceedings, a Korean fisherman named Young, who had run resistance operations in the South Sea, mentioned, in passing, that he needed to be back on his vessel by the following Friday, because the mackerel were running, and he hadn't missed the mackerel run in 30 years, and he wasn't going to start now. The Finari representative excused himself from the table. He was gone for a considerable time. When he came back, he agreed to every proposed term without discussion or amendment. He signed where he was asked to sign. He did not make eye contact with anyone in the room. Jung never understood why the negotiation had gone so smoothly. He thought he was a good diplomat. He had not read the Dominion's withdrawal assessment. The Finari had read it before the ink was dry. They knew exactly what a species was that had lived in the deep ocean for millennia and called the mackerel run a reason to be home by Friday. They knew what they were sitting across the table from. I went home. I took my boat out the following morning, before sunrise, in the way that I take my boat out every morning, that the sea will allow it. I ran north along the Hokkaido coast into water that was cold and dark, and exactly as it had always been. Indifferent to my presence, indifferent to the events of the past year, indifferent to everything except its own deep, ancient, continuing motion, I set a line. I watched the water. I read the color of it, the smell of it, the way the surface moved above the different layers of temperature below. My father's voice was in my head. The sea will give you everything. If you know how to ask. They came from the stars to take our ocean. They found people who had been asking it for 40,000 years. It was never going to go any other way.